Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and everybody in between. Welcome on into the channel. My name is, of course, the Kexman, and we have our final zone review today. That is, of course, Azj-Kahet, the Nerubian stronghold deep in the earthen areas of Azeroth. This is a very, very interesting zone. I'm really excited to get into this one. Obviously, first off, a huge thank you to everybody who has been supporting the channel. It means the absolute world to me. If you are watching this video, you do like it, give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. There's plenty more alpha content coming in. As per usual, this video is going to look at three aspects of the zone. We're going to be looking at the zone itself and how it looks, the questing experience inside the zone, and the dungeons that are available in the zone. So, without any further ado, let's take a look at the zone of Azj-Kahet. As a zone in the War Within, Azj-Kahet is definitely an interesting one. Simply for the fact that it is relatively different to what we have seen previously. Hallowfall, the Ringing Deeps were both very open areas, high ceilings, whereas Azj-Kahet is much more compact. It's still relatively open in comparison to some of the previous caverns we've seen, such as Zaralek caverns, but it is definitely a deliberate choice to make it slightly more claustrophobic. It feels slightly more hostile, as it realistically should, considering it is the enemy's main stronghold that we have seen for this first part of the War Within. This is where the Nerubians effectively call home in this area. So again, the design choice does make sense to me. I really enjoy the way that the zone is almost split into sort of, effectively you've got one part which is 2/3 little strongholds here and there, little Nerubian bases, flora, fauna that take up the area, and meanwhile we've got 1/3 that is entirely dominated by the City of Threads, which, if you are a fan of Suramar, you're absolutely going to love this area. It does have a very similar feel. It feels like a living, breathing city. The architecture is absolutely stunning. It feels like this is the Azj-Nerub that we all wanted in Wrath of the Lich King. We wanted to explore that area, and here we get a much better look at what a Nerubian city would look like, and Blizzard does not disappoint. Azj-Nerub would have been amazing, but I think given the changes in technology, advancements, where we are now at a point where Blizzard can fully deliver on what they wanted to do potentially back in Wrath of the Lich King. I will say that Azj-Kahet does feel as though it is a place that Zaralek Caverns was almost designed as a prototype for. I know I mentioned previously in the Ringing Deeps feedback video that that area was what Zaralek wanted to be. Now we've got our hands on Azj-Kahet. This definitely feels more akin to what Zaralek Caverns should have been, and was almost a proof of concept before they developed this Azj-Kahet zone. I'm a big fan of it. I can understand people's concerns with the idea of feeling claustrophobic. They don't want to be underground all the time, but out of the two underground zones that we have had in the War Within, this definitely feels the closest to an actual cave, but I don't inherently think that that is a bad thing. As I mentioned, this area is deliberately designed, I feel, to evoke the feeling of claustrophobia, to evoke the feeling of being stuck underground. And honestly, I absolutely love it. I think the design team across the board for this zone have been exceptional. But as we've mentioned previously, a zone is nothing without its quests, and let's see if the questing team can live up to what the design team have created. The questing in Azj-Kahet once again does a very good job at getting across the cultures of the Nerubians that we meet down here. There's nothing special, there are no quests that do anything new, and honestly, going through the expansion leading up to Azj-Kahet, it did feel to me as though Blizzard had decided to stop reinventing the wheel. Questlines are pretty much a way to get across the lore, the culture, the area that you're in, rather than doing something new and engaging. They can put that in content such as delves, in dungeons, in raids. There's various other ways they can introduce new things to the gameplay loop of World of Warcraft. The focus seems to have come on the actual content, the lore of the quests, and with Azj-Kahet, they have absolutely nailed it. The main questline introduces us to some fantastic characters. Widow Arachni is one of them, this almost spy mistress that you meet that seems to be helping us, but definitely could have some ulterior motives moving forward. Anub Azal and Monty Gazlo, a pairing that I never thought I wanted, is another questline that kind of gives you an introduction to the workings of the Nerubian, I suppose, military and the way that this race functions and the little maneuvers that people have. The Nerubians seem to be more of a political race than I think a lot of people were going to expect out of them, and you get a lot of tastes of this. It does feel very Game of Thrones-esque, little pieces on a chessboard that are moving here and there to try and overtake each other. They're all vying for power. We do also, speaking of vying for power, get introduced to Executor Nizrek, who does seem to be a little worm inside of the hierarchy of the Nerubians. They're in the higher caste, the higher rungs of Nerubian society, directly with Queen Ansurek herself. And again, as mentioned, this main story questline gets that across. We get a fantastic look at the city of Threads during the main story questline. We explore the bazaar. We see various different aspects of the Nerubians' life that very much mimic our own, and that does seem to be a relatively large thing that is put across during this questline, in that, yes, we are fighting the Nerubians. We always thought them as kind of just, oh, they are just spiders, but their culture and what they do as a people is very, very similar to our own. In regards to side quests, there are some very interesting ones. I think we do get a look at some characters in regards to the crash up above, spoilers, of Dalaran. We rescue them from some hives that very much remind me of Silithus and Anchorage, that area. Very, very similar stylings. However, the most interesting one for me is a side quest that takes place in an area that is effectively been taken over by the Niffin, but also the Venture Company. There are a lot of goblins here, and there are some breadcrumbs during this side quest that lead me to believe we are going to be seeing a lot more out of the goblins moving forward in the War Within. What role that's going to play, I don't know, but we see them in the Ringing Deeps, setting up areas around there. So for me, that could end up being a pretty interesting thread that we're going to have to unravel. There's also some side quests with a farming area. It seems to be farming stag beetles or something very, very similar to stag beetles. There are Nerubians there that you effectively help, and they very much say that they are only helping us because it helps them. They don't care for us. We recruit some Niffin to help out, and it seems as though this is going to unlock a daily area that you're going to be able to use, very similar to the farm that we saw in Mists of Pandaria, only this time we're not growing veg. It seems as though we're growing stuff like silk. We are using the stag beetles to get truffles, and I would imagine there's probably going to be transmogs, pets, mounts that are associated with this daily area. Again, a side quest isn't necessary, but adds a lot of flavor to the zone, and I think from all of them, Azj-Kahet might actually end up being my favorite leveling zone, or my favorite questing zone out of all of them, simply because it has a lot of intrigue, leaves a lot of threads laying out for future events, and I'm very, very excited for it. Speaking of flavor though, we all know that dungeons can potentially add the best flavor to a zone, so let's take a look at what Azj-Kahet has to offer. The dungeons of Azj-Kahet are very different from each other. Arakara City of Echoes is a very short dungeon in comparison to some of the others that we have seen. It reminds me of more of Souls from Legion in that regard. The second dungeon, City of Threads, is more reminiscent of the Archway from the Legion expansion again. And honestly, it's nice to have these two dungeons in the same zone so you get a different feel for both of them. Arakara City of Echoes, once again, as I said, reminds me of more of Souls. It is a very linear, very quick dungeon. There are only 3 bosses inside this area. One of them is a spider boss. You come to expect that from an Arubian area. And Azj-Kahet is the second boss, and honestly the one for me that has the most potential. I thoroughly enjoyed this boss. I think on some of the higher difficulties it's going to be very exceptional. You have to move in and out, you have to avoid a bunch of these huge impales that the boss does. However, on the mythic difficulty there is also an ad that will stop you from moving. We haven't obviously seen mythic difficulty yet, but the dungeon journal does explain this, which I think could add some very interesting changes to how you would approach this boss fight. And then the final boss wasn't that memorable. I think tuning was a little bit off for us, so it was kind of just a smash and grab when we got to that point. But afterwards I did kind of think to myself, this is more of Souls-like. I think if you're going to be looking to get some crests, if you're looking to get the War Within version of Flight Stones, which are called Valor Stones, this is probably the dungeon that you're going to want to run, simply because it is so fast. City of Threads, on the other hand, is the opposite. Again, as I mentioned, it's very reminiscent of the Archway, very reminiscent of Court of Stars, both Suramar dungeons in Legion, and the fact that this one also takes place in a city is probably no coincidence. There was some inspiration drawn from those two, I would imagine. There was a slightly annoying section in the middle of the dungeon where you're trying to find these stealthed mobs, but you're using pheromones to find them. It was a little bit confusing as to exactly where we needed to go, and the pheromones themselves didn't actively kick in until you were already close to the target. So there was a lot of running around trying to find the breadcrumb trail that these mobs had left behind. Now, if these mobs are in the same place every single time, then it completely negates that after you've done this dungeon 2 or 3 times, because you're just going to know. And if they move them every single time you're in the dungeon, it will end up becoming very frustrating, specifically on Mythic Plus when you are dealing with a timer. So I'll be interested to see how that's changed, because I do think it should be changed slightly. Maybe have the pheromones constantly running so you always know where you're going next, but still having to avoid patrols and such. We'll have to wait and see how Blizzard approach that one. However, the final boss, Ezo, the Grand Splicer, is probably the boss that I'm most looking forward to when we get onto the higher difficulty levels. They have 2 mobs before them that you have 2 obviously very different abilities on, and then when you face off against the boss, they will then use those abilities. So you will have learnt the 2 abilities beforehand, and then you go into the boss and you have to deal with them alongside obviously the boss mechanics that are happening at the same time. A lot of potential here. I'm excited to see how this one is going to play out on the higher difficulty levels, and the fact that you are inside the City of Threads mean that this dungeon looks absolutely beautiful, because the zone of City of Threads, as I've already mentioned, is fantastic, and because it is in the open world, there are areas that you do recognize, which again I think is an excellent thing to have inside a dungeon. I think recognizing something you've seen on the outside world inside a dungeon and going, oh, I know this place, infinitely helps tie it together into the world. So between these two, I think my favorite is probably City of Threads, despite having that slightly annoying middle section that I think could maybe use a little change. Arakara City of Echoes is a very quick, very fun dungeon, but for purely content's sake, for like the meat of a dungeon, City of Threads for me is the better of the 2. So there it is, folks, the final zone of War Within Azj-Kahet. One that I think may potentially split the player base down the middle. Some folks are going to absolutely love it. Some folks are going to absolutely detest it. I fall on the side of absolutely loving this zone. I think the quest line is exceptional. I think it has its very own beauty that is separate from Hallowfall, from the Ringing Deeps. And honestly, I'm excited to see how this plays out in the future. City of Threads could be a very exciting place to revisit after the initial phase where we have taken out, or we believe we may take out Queen Ansurek by the end of the raid. Next week, I will obviously be doing another review. This time, it will probably just be an overview of the War Within, the quest lines, the zones, everything that kind of comes with it, a quick bringing together of my thoughts, but there'll also be daily content going out of various different aspects of the alpha. There are still more dungeons to do. There are still delves that we need to dive into, no pun intended. And not only that, but also as the alpha updates, there'll be mythic, there'll be raid testing, all of that, so that will all be on the channel as well. As always, my name has been the Kexman. Thank you so much for joining me here, and I will catch you folks next time.